The message arrived without encryption, without clearance codes, without even the courtesy of a diplomatic header. Just raw, unfiltered words tearing through every known communication channel at once. It didn't knock. It didn't request access. It forced its way in. Military command grids flickered. Civilian networks stuttered mid-transmission. Deep space listening posts, stations that hadn't received a signal in decades, suddenly came alive, their silent halls echoing with a voice that carried no distortion, no hesitation, and no fear. Across Earth, screens froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. In orbit, battle-hardened officers stared at their consoles as system overrides cascaded beyond their control. No origin point, no signal degradation, no delay. It was everywhere all at once, as if space itself had decided to speak. Stop attacking, or we stop pretending to be courteous. The words didn't just appear. They lingered, etched into displays, burned into audio feeds, vibrating through the metal bones of ships and stations alike. There was no identifiable speaker, yet the tone was unmistakably human, calm, controlled, and beneath it, something colder, something older than diplomacy. Commander Alara Vance felt it before she understood it. A tightening in her chest, a quiet shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks when the world seems to hold its breath. She stood alone on the observation deck, Earth turning slowly beneath her, clouds drifting in peaceful indifference. It looked so fragile from here, so unaware. Her eyes flicked to the stars beyond, points of light, steady and distant. But she knew better. Out there, hidden in the dark between those stars, were ships that had been testing humanity for years. Probing, pushing, waiting for a response that never came. Until now. What did we just send? A voice whispered over the comms, uncertain, almost afraid to ask. Alara didn't answer, because the truth wasn't in the words. It was in what the words meant. For decades, humanity had worn a mask, patient, diplomatic, endlessly willing to negotiate. They had apologized when attacked, negotiated when provoked, smiled when insulted, not because they were weak, but because they believed restraint was strength. That courtesy was the line between civilization and chaos. But this message, this wasn't diplomacy. This was the absence of it. Across the galaxy, alien empires paused mid-strategy. War councils fell silent. Analysts replayed the transmission again and again, searching for hidden meaning, for weakness, for bluff. They found none. Because there was no bluff, only a warning. And somewhere deep in places no map acknowledged, something stirred, quietly responding to a signal that wasn't meant for the galaxy, but for itself. Alara exhaled slowly, her reflection staring back at her from the glass, calm, composed, but no longer pretending. They've heard us, she murmured under her breath. But the thought that followed was the one that lingered. Now they would have to decide whether to listen or to find out what happens when humanity stops pretending. Commander Alara Vance stood alone at the edge of the observation deck, her silhouette framed by the cold glow of Earth below, blue, white, and deceptively peaceful. From this height, the planet looked untouched by conflict, as if the wars, the losses, the quiet compromises had never happened. But Alara knew better. She had lived through the reports, signed off on the evacuations, watched the casualty numbers rise in silence while politicians spoke of stability. Above her, beyond the thin veil of atmosphere, the stars were no longer just distant lights. They were occupied, watching, waiting. The tactical overlay flickered across the glass in front of her, dozens of foreign vessels hovering at the edges of human-controlled space. Their formations were too precise to be accidental, too still to be harmless. Each one carried the weight of an empire that had long since decided humanity was something to manage, not something to fear. Contact ranges holding, a voice reported softly from behind her. Lieutenant Armin Reyes stood near the command console, his posture rigid, eyes locked on the scrolling data. They're not advancing.
Not yet. Not yet.
The words hung in the air like a quiet threat. Alara didn't turn. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon where Earth's curvature met the black of space. Somewhere out there, beyond the visible spectrum, entire fleets lingered just outside engagement range, testing boundaries, measuring responses, cataloging every hesitation humanity had ever shown. For years, this had been the pattern. A border incursion dismissed as a navigation error. A destroyed outpost labeled an unfortunate misunderstanding. A missing convoy buried under layers of diplomatic language until it became nothing more than a footnote. Humanity had endured it all with restraint so calculated it bordered on unnatural. They negotiated when others demanded. They compromised when others threatened. They chose patience over pride, diplomacy over retaliation, not because they couldn't fight, but because they believed the alternative would cost too much. Alara exhaled slowly, the faint reflection of the orbital station lights tracing across her face. She remembered her first assignment, years ago, standing in a similar chamber, listening as senior officials spoke about unity, about coexistence, about earning a place among the stars. Back then it had sounded like hope. Now, it sounded like a story they told themselves. "Commander," Rhea said again, quieter this time. "Do we respond to their positioning?" Finally, Alara turned. Her expression was calm, but there was something different in her eyes, something heavier, sharpened by time and loss. "No," she replied evenly. "We observe." Reyes hesitated just for a second, as if weighing the answer against everything they had been trained to expect. Then he nodded and returned to his console. Observe. It had always been the human way. Watch, wait, endure. But as Alara looked back toward the silent fleets hanging in the void, she felt the shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a change in gravity before a collapse. Because this time, it wasn't just observation. This time, something behind the silence was changing. And for the first time since humanity reached the stars, courtesy felt less like a principle and more like a decision that could be undone. The attacks didn't come as a single blow. They came as a pattern, subtle at first, almost deniable, until denial became impossible. It began with silence. A mining colony on the outer edge of the Perseus Drift went dark without warning. No distress beacon, no debris field. One moment, a functioning outpost with 2,000 workers. The next, nothing, just empty orbit and unanswered calls. Analysts labeled it a systems failure, a tragic accident, the kind of explanation that sounded clean enough to file away and forget. But then it happened again. A diplomatic convoy, clearly marked, escorted, broadcasting peace credentials across every known frequency, was intercepted mid-transit. The last transmission wasn't a call for help. It was confusion. Static-laced voices asking why targeting systems were locking onto them, why Allied ships weren't responding, then silence. By the time the footage reached command, it had already been sanitized, redacted, reframed as unverified engagement. The official statement spoke of uncertainty, of incomplete data, but the truth didn't need confirmation. Commander Alara Vance stood in the dim glow of the war room, watching the raw feed replay on a restricted channel. No filters, no edits, just the cold reality of it. Ships that never fired a shot, torn apart like they were never meant to exist. Her jaw tightened. "How many now?" she asked quietly. 17 confirmed incidents, Reyes replied, his voice low, controlled but not steady. "Possibly more. We're still losing contact with outlying stations." 17. Not accidents, not misunderstandings. 17 messages, each one louder than the last. The room was filled with people, analysts, officers, strategists, but no one spoke unless necessary. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, something growing. Screens flickered with data streams, threat assessments, projections, all of them pointing toward the same conclusion no one wanted to say out loud. This wasn't random. This was pressure. Alara moved closer to the central display as another report came in. An outpost near the Helios corridor, its signal degrading in real time. The transmission was broken, fragments of sound fighting through interference. "And they're inside the perimeter." Not responding to hails. "This isn't a warning." The feed cut. Gone. Alara closed her eyes for a brief moment, just long enough to feel it, the weight of every decision that had led to this. Years of restraint, years of choosing not to escalate, of trusting that patience would be seen as strength. "They think we won't act," Reyes said, barely above a whisper. Alara opened her eyes again, staring at the empty signal marker where the outpost had been. "They don't think," she replied, her voice steady but colder now. "They assume, and assumptions, were dangerous." Across the room, no one moved. No one needed to. Because they all felt it, the shift. Not loud, not sudden, but undeniable, like the slow, inevitable rise of pressure before something fractures beyond repair. Humanity had been patient. Humanity had been reasonable. Humanity had been courteous. But courtesy had limits, and somewhere beneath the silence, beneath the restraint, beneath the years of being underestimated, something was beginning to break, because humanity had never been weak. They had been careful. The realization didn't arrive as a revelation shouted across command decks. It settled in slowly, like a truth too heavy to ignore any longer. Commander Alara Vance stood in a restricted chamber far below orbital command, a place not listed on any official schematics. The air here felt different, colder, still, as if even sound had been filtered before it was allowed to exist. Clearance confirmed. An unseen voice murmured as reinforced doors sealed behind her with a final, echoing thud. Ahead, the chamber opened into something vast, far larger than anything that should have existed beneath a civilian station. A hollow sphere of metal and shadow, its inner surface lined with structures that didn't resemble ships, or weapons, or anything the galaxy had ever classified. Alara stepped forward slowly, her boots echoing faintly against the polished floor. "How long has this been active?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Longer than most of recorded contact history," Reyes replied from behind her, his voice quieter here, as if instinct told him not to speak too loudly. It was never about building fleets, no, it wasn't. At the center of the chamber, suspended in a field of faintly bending light, something pulsed, slow, rhythmic, almost alive. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It simply existed, distorting the space around it in ways that made the mind struggle to hold on to its shape. Alara felt it more than she saw it. A pressure behind her eyes. A weight in her chest. "This is what we've been hiding?" she asked. "This," Reyes said carefully, "is what we've been avoiding using. Because centuries ago, before alliances, before councils, before humanity learned to speak softly among the stars, there had been a different path. One that led not to cooperation, but to dominance. A path abandoned not out of inability, but out of choice. The galaxy had outlawed technologies like this long before humanity ever arrived. Not because they were ineffective, but because they worked too well. They think we're behind," Alara whispered, her gaze fixed on the shifting distortion. "That we're catching up." Reyes didn't respond. He didn't need to, because the truth was, worse, humanity had surpassed them long ago. They had just decided not to show. A sudden alert cut through the stillness, sharp, insistent. Alara turned as data flooded her retinal display. Earth's outer defense grid had been breached. Multiple hostile signatures, coordinated, aggressive. The line had been crossed. For a moment, no one moved, and then Alara exhaled slowly, the sound steady. "Controlled. Begin final protocol," she said. Reyes hesitated. "Just a fraction of a second." "Commander, once we initiate—" "I know," she interrupted, her voice calm but absolute. There would be no going back. No more pretense. No more restraint disguised as diplomacy. Alara took one last look at the thing suspended before her. The quiet, impossible answer to every threat humanity had endured in silence. End courtesy protocols. The words were simple, but as they left her lips, something deep within the chamber responded. The pulsing distortion sharpened. Space itself seemed to inhale, and across distances no signal could measure. Something ancient, something human, woke up. The response did not begin with a sound. It began with absence. Across the contested edge of human space, coalition fleets advanced in perfect formation. Rows of warships layered in defensive grids, weapons primed, shields humming with contained power. Their commanders expected resistance. They expected missiles, counterfire, desperate attempts to hold the line. Instead, their sensors faltered. "Signal degradation across forward arrays," one officer reported. Confusion creeping into a voice trained never to show it. "I'm losing telemetry on Wing 3. No, wait." The display didn't explode. It emptied. Where ships had been seconds before, massive armored constructs of alloy and energy, there was nothing. No debris, no radiation spike, no wreckage drifting in silent orbit. Just absence. What happened? Another voice demanded, sharper now, edged with something dangerously close to fear. Report. But there was nothing to report. Because nothing had happened. And that was the problem. On the human side of the line, there were no battle cries, no triumphant declarations. Commander Alara Vance stood in absolute stillness as data scrolled across her interface. Not warnings, not projections. Confirmations. One by one, hostile signatures vanished. Not destroyed. Removed. She watched as entire formations unraveled, not from impact, not from force, but from something far more precise. Space itself seemed to distort around the enemy fleets, bending inward like a closing hand. Light stretched. Time lagged, and then they were gone. Phase integrity holding, Reyes reported, his voice tight, almost reverent. Field expansion within predicted thresholds. Alara didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the tactical display. But what she was seeing wasn't just a battlefield. It was a boundary being erased. Out in the void, surviving coalition vessels broke formation. Commands were shouted across fractured comm channels, desperate attempts to regroup, to understand, to fight something that refused to behave like an enemy. Weapons were fired. They passed through empty space. Targeting systems locked onto coordinates that no longer contained anything real. Because humanity wasn't meeting force with force. They were rewriting the terms of engagement. A cruiser attempted to retreat, its engines flaring as it pivoted away from the unseen threat. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like it would escape. Then space folded. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just decisively. The ship stretched into a line of impossible light, and then it wasn't there anymore. Enemy formations collapsing, Reyes said, barely above a whisper now. They're retreating. Of course they were. Fear doesn't come from destruction. It comes from the realization that destruction isn't even necessary. Alara exhaled slowly, her reflection flickering in the dim glow of the command interface. There was no satisfaction in her expression. No anger, just certainty. We're not pursuing, she said calmly. Reyes looked up, surprised. Commander? They've already received the message. Because this was never about winning a battle. It was about ending a pattern. Across the battlefield, the silence deepened. No explosions, no debris fields, no victory calls, just empty space where an armada used to be. And in that silence, the truth spread faster than any signal ever could. Humanity had not escalated the war. They had concluded it, without rage, without warning, without leaving anything behind, except the understanding that some lines once crossed do not lead to conflict. They lead to disappearance. The transmission didn't rush. It arrived slowly, deliberately, as if even time had been instructed to move with care. Across the galaxy, what remained of the coalition gathered in silence. Emergency channels were open. War rooms once filled with certainty now echoed with something far less stable. Uncertainty, sharpened into fear. Screens flickered with empty coordinates where fleets had once stood. Tactical maps, once dense with power and projection, now looked hollow. Incomplete. And then the signal came. No encryption. No origin trace. No interference. Just a single, clear channel, cutting through every system like a quiet voice in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. On thousands of worlds, leaders leaned forward. Commanders held their breath. Entire civilizations paused, not because they were ordered to, but because something deeper told them this moment mattered. Commander Alara Vance stood alone once more on the observation deck, Earth turning beneath her in calm defiance of everything that had just happened. The storm had passed. No alarms, no incoming threats. Just the quiet hum of a planet that had survived. Again, she didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the message wasn't hers alone. It was humanity's. The screen before her illuminated, soft at first, then steady. And with it, the voice calm, even unshaken. We asked you to stop. No anger. No triumph. Just truth, delivered with a weight that pressed against every listening mind. Across distant star systems, reactions varied. Some flinched. Some stared in disbelief. Some refused to understand what they had just witnessed. But none of them could ignore it. Because this wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. A pause followed, long enough to let the silence settle, long enough for every civilization to feel the space where their power used to be. You chose not to listen. Alara closed her eyes briefly, not in regret, but in acknowledgement. The words weren't spoken with pride. There was no satisfaction in them. Only finality. Behind her, the stars stretched endlessly, vast, indifferent, unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted within them. Because for the first time, the galaxy had seen what humanity truly was, when it stopped holding back. The transmission ended without ceremony. No closing statement, no demand for surrender, no declaration of dominance. Just silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of understanding. Across the void, surviving fleets powered down their weapons, not by command, but by instinct. Borders that had once been contested fell still. Signals once filled with strategy turned into quiet observation. No one spoke of retaliation. No one spoke of war. Because they had seen the outcome, and they believed it. Ilara opened her eyes, her reflection faint against the glass as Earth rotated slowly beneath her. Billions of lives, unaware of how close everything had come to ending. Billions who would wake tomorrow thinking the stars were just stars. She let out a slow breath. Humanity had never needed to prove its strength. It had only ever needed to decide when to stop pretending it didn't exist, and now that it had, the galaxy would never forget the moment it learned the difference between a patient species and a restrained one.